release of Crusher Stampede, I saw people talking about this place called Forge World, and how their models are great and how they stomp muchly. Now, I like my Hive Guard, but I love my Exocrine. I like big bugs using big weapons. I guess a lingering delight in seeing Starship Troopers that first time has stayed with me. So I took a butcher's, and the Barbed Hierodule really appealed to me. So I signed up for notifications, and as luck would have it, it became available just a couple of days later. I pounced, bought one, and made sure to give the community a heads up that they were actually available now. Now this I was not expecting. It was over a month before it shipped. Seems Forge World take your orders, and I guess don't actually bother printing the models until they reach a certain number of purchases. I mean, I see the logic, but announcing that the model is in stock kinda suggests that, the bloody thing is actually in stock. This is like reserving a car in Seinfeld.
I don't understand. I made a reservation. Do you have my reservation?
Yes, we do. Unfortunately, we ran out of cars.
But the reservation keeps the car here. That's why you have the reservation.
I know why we have reservations.
I don't think you do.
So instead of listing this as in stock, I think they should just list, we'll get round to it. Anyway, this screenshot is after the price hike. I actually got it for the cheap price of a measly $175. It's okay, I can pay rent and eat another time. But I really like the look of it, and loved those giant cannon. Okay, it finally arrived, and I hauled it out of the box. First thing, this model is massive. The assembly booklet recommends all of these weird saws and files and other esoteric torture tools that I've seen in movies to properly prep and clean up the model. But seeing as I lack them, and I'm not spending even more money to carve up an already goddamn costly model, well, let's improvise. For the most part, a standard utility knife handled most of it. There are struts and stuff on the limb joints that are easy to chop off. All of the limbs are flat surfaces against flat surfaces, except for the bio cannon, which has ball and socket connection, so a bit of a nail file to round it off and ensure a good fit. The legs had some larger bits beyond what my utility could handle, but a steak knife sawed them off great. However, the base has a giant column of resin attached to it, way beyond what the steak knife could hack. But a bread knife and some patience really worked a treat. Okay, assembly. This really pissed me off. Actually, no, that's an exaggeration. Some of it was vexing, some of it was fine. Because the hooves have to go into two very specific slots in the base, I was worried about gluing them wrong, especially because the connection between legs and torso, as I mentioned, are just two blank surfaces, not male and female slots like you get with the Lictor legs, so it would be really easy to get this misaligned. I kinda scoped it out and superglued one of them. Remember, it's resin. Citadel glue won't do anything here. And then once that leg was dry, I set it up, got a good idea of where the other one needed to be, and then eyeballed it. Worked a treat. The hooves drop into the base slots just perfectly. Now, the jaws, fine. The head, fine. The arms, however, no idea why, but they just do not like to glue easily. It was incredibly frustrating to hold them in place for ages, let go, and watch them sag and droop. Then redo it, sit there, holding the limb in place for ages and ages, let go, and it droops and sags. Eventually, I started just balancing it on a roll of masking tape so I could leave it to dry for hours and hours, and this finally did the trick. Now, I pondered the vents. It's odd that they are so dull for such an intricate model. The underbelly and where the flesh meets the chitin has amazing detail, and I guess it just looks like the designer just ran out of oomph. Did he reach them on a Friday afternoon and just wanted to get to their weekend? I mean, all the other models have awesome actual hollow vents, some with some very nice details. So why are these solid? Someone said that they're not vents, that they're actually armor, but the assembly booklet specifically says vents. I found some 3D prints online and thought about just printing just the vents and modifying them to fit. I also pondered just using some leftover claws and just improvising something a bit more detailed. But you know what? I'm going to stay on track and use these and see how they look. If I hate them, I'll snip them off and replace them with something else. First up, you end up with some pretty massive gaps on the limbs, which I'll be dealing with via Army Painter green stuff modelling clay. I grabbed a little bit of blue and another bit of yellow and squeezed and pinched them until they turned green and then rolled out some slim lengths. These went in fine and filled the gaps, but it was hard to mimic the grooves and texture. I tried a cocktail stick, the back of an X-Acto, neither was that good. Online recommends dental tools, but then I remembered my lockpicks. These came with a book on lockpicking, which I got because while doing site verifications of empty office buildings, several times I almost got locked in rooms or areas, and so started learning to pick locks and packed these guys to ensure I can get out if it happens again. Plus, I don't know, it's actually kind of fun. For the more subtle lines, such as those under the jaw, breaking out the Mr. Dissolved putty, and using an older brush, I painted some lines in and the putty sealed it perfectly. Once assembled, there were a few weird stray bits of resin, especially on any thorns and on the feed pipe for the cannon. An X-Acto easily strips off these stray lines of resin and tidies it up. An additional stage, a good wash with a scrubbing brush to make sure I got all of the debris out and got off any weird oils or any other leftovers. On to priming. I'm not attaching it to the base just yet, because unlike the Exocrine and the Carnifex, this critter stands really tall so that the underbelly is far more visible, and I want to be able to get in there and do a good job. So I blasted the Hierodule and the base separately. Onto my fleet colours. A layer of Macragge blue on the skin, and then the Zerus purple on the chitin, and just watch your paint pot drain away from doing this. I used a large brush so I could dab and wiggle and twirl because this thing has so many nooks and crannies, bullet holes, troughs and ridges to coat. White scar in the mouth and in the vents and joints on the cannon muzzles, and because these vents have such a distinct edge that is much more acute than I've encountered on other models, once I applied the nihilic oxide, it pulled up perfectly in these excellently distinct valleys. When it went over the edges in a few places, it was really easy to load up a brush with blue, hold it horizontal to the gill valley, and just move across to colour it back in. Now, a comprehensive layer of Nuln oil and avoiding all the glowing bits. I left it to dry arse up so that the Nuln oil pooled under the chitin plates where there is all this nifty connective tissue. Once the main layer was dry, I watered down a little pool of Nuln oil, and with the beastie on its side, I gently added the watery mix onto the nihilic oxide so that it stays in place and dries to just add a hint of darker accent to the grooves. Once dry, I flipped it over and did the same on the other side. I decided to not add any to the roaring mouth or the muzzles. I think I'm just going to give those a little dry brush of white so that they're the most brilliantly glowing parts of the creature. Because this is pretty watery, while it dries, I turned to the base and grabbed some Army Painter grey primer and started with a nice dry brush across the whole rubble-strewn surface, adding a little squirt of lawful white and a little more of a delicate dry brush across the large chunks, and finally a few hints of white dry brushing to accent the big blocks. Of course, for some reason, there are two little rippers in the base. Dude, come on, I've got this behemoth resin model to paint. Don't add two annoying little fiddly things as well. I mean, they don't add anything, they don't serve any purpose. I guess fine, okay, I'll paint them. Now, breaking out the dry Imric blue, I dabbed my dry brush into the pot and then used it to paint the scything talons a base colour. This helps get the majority of the paint off the brush, and as it just starts to run out, it's suddenly in a perfect state of readiness for dry brushing. Some gentle sweeps on the underbelly, the limbs, the weapons, and the underside of the tail, and along the side of the jaws. Normally, I get my dry brush ready from painting the tail tip, but this bug is armoured with chitin plates all the way to the end. In addition to the scything talons, it has some significant spiky thorny things on the legs and some bigger claws on the talons. So I started painting these in a solid colour, and this kept me dry brushing without having to dab my brush on anything non-model related. Dry brushing carefully on the sides of the vents did a great job of covering the nihilic oxide, making the skin where it drops in Imric blue. With everything that's blue highlighted with the Imric, time to add a more frugal dry brush of Ethereum Blue Dry. And again, by painting the scything talon and the other horn and spike tips, I can get the brush in a ready condition to dry brush the other areas. Then a very, very tiny dry brush of white scar on the talon tips and along the teeth, and where the muzzle of the cannon meets the nihilic oxide. I also went back in with the Nuln oil, leaving the beastie on its side and putting some in the eye socket area, so that when it comes to painting the eyeball, it'll stand out more. I also touched up a few of the bullet holes where an air pocket had caused the Nuln oil to not settle and dry, and this left me with a much nicer dark pit. Okay, breaking out the Genestealer purple, and I started dry brushing up from the raised chitin plates. This application on the edges also covers those stray sweeps of blue that grazed the purple as I was working around the beastie. And then a single dab of moot green for a nice glowing eye. Then a quick bit of additional painting on the two very small rippers, purple, blue, Nuln oil and a light dry brush. And we're ready to drop this big boy onto its base. A squirt of glue, and I propped it up so that it can dry in place. Turns out a bottle of army painter is the exact right height to prop it up and get the correct angle. And lastly, from about a foot away, a quick spray of varnish from every angle. Let it dry and then add a second protective coat. And here we have my first Forge World model, all painted up and ready to start blasting with biocannon and tearing things apart with scything talons.